Hi, I'm Joseph Rushing, and this is an introductory video to HTML and CSS. Now this video is going to go over how to read HTML and CSS. This video tutorial is not going to go over how to make your first website. However, after learning how to read HTML and CSS, you can look at template files and existing websites, and you can look through that HTML and CSS, and you can understand how that website is made. So let's begin. First off, what is HTML? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And when you load a website, you're loading a HTML document. So an HTML document is a web page. That web page is what happens after a web browser opens up the HTML document.
So HTML is a markup language, and a markup language is a language that uses a system of tags and content. And so a tag modifies content. So content is what you see on a web page. Some people will also call this an element or your plain text. I'm going to be referring to it as content. And so let's say you have something that you're reading on your website, and you want this text to be a special size or color, or maybe you want it to display in the middle of your web browser, or maybe you want it on the left side. Any of this is going to be controlled by a tag. And so this is what a tag and content looks like in HTML. H1 stands for heading 1, and heading 1 is a tag that controls the size of content by default. And so every tag has to have an opening and closing tag. You can tell a closing tag from that / and the tag on the right side. If you don't have both a opening and closing tag, then your web browser, when it opens up the HTML document, it won't know how to display your code properly. And so what we want to get is this. We have large text. If you didn't have both the opening and the closing tag, your web browser might not show that at all, or it might show it incorrectly. So maybe it won't be the right size.
So how can you modify those tags? Let's say I want to use a header 1 tag, but I want the text to be even larger. Well, that's when you start using CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And generally, you're going to be using CSS as a file in addition to the HTML file. What I mean by that is that you have a .html file. You also have a .css file. And the .css file modifies tags within the HTML file. So this is what a CSS piece of code looks like. So if we're going to modify that header 1 tag, we have header 1, squiggly bracket, font size 36 pixels, squiggly bracket. Now, just like the opening and closing tags, in CSS you have to have a beginning squiggly bracket and an ending squiggly bracket. And after each piece of code, like the font size 36 pixels, you want to have that semicolon. And in between the piece of code and the value, so the piece of code being font size and then the value being 36, you also have to have that colon. Now let's look at an example to see how HTML and CSS work together. So on the left side of the screen we have a HTML file, and on the right side we have a CSS file. So here we have the same text from the previous examples. We're using the tag of heading 1 to modify our content IM text. And now we have some CSS that is forcing the content to be a font size of 36 pixels. So this is what it's going to look like in a web browser. But let's say we wanted to make the text even bigger. We're going to use the same heading 1 tag, but this time, instead of 36 pixels, we're going to make the font size 54 pixels. So this is going to make our content even bigger. So without a CSS page, a web browser will use its own default settings for an HTML tag. The problem with using default settings, though,
is that you're not guaranteed that every web browser will be using the same default settings. So by using CSS, this way you're guaranteeing that your website will look the same on any web browser.
So this is a more complex version of a HTML and a CSS file. The HTML file on the left is a full-blown file, same with the CSS. So in the HTML file, we have the HTML tag at the top, and at the very bottom you can see a closing tag. It has to have those closing tags to each open tag. Just below the open tag for the HTML, you can see a head tag. Now you put things like the title of your website or things like or a link to your CSS file. Those sort of things go in the head tag. Here in the example, the only thing I have is a link to the CSS file. So again, if you don't link to a CSS file, then when a web browser opens your HTML document, it uses its own defaults. So outside of the head tag, below all this, we have a body tag. Now a body tag describes everything on the web page. And then inside that body tag, we have a div tag. You can think of a div tag as a box. So everything within that div tag gets shown within a box. And then within that box, we have the tags of header 1, header 2, and paragraph. In the CSS, we have 3 pieces of code. We have a body, and we're going to change the body color, the background of the body, to be gray. Generally, the default is white. And then below the body tag, we have a header 1 tag. And we want to make sure that it's a font size of 40 pixels, and we want to change the color of the text to be green. In the header 2 tag, we want the font size to be 20 pixels.
So this is what that HTML and CSS actually look like when it's opened in Firefox. So here we can actually see what the HTML and CSS is doing. The body tag represents the whole web page, and a div represents a box around the content that is inside of it. So here's a brief wrap-up. We start with CSS, and CSS modifies tags. Tags go into HTML, and tags modify content. And content is what you see when you go to a web page. And so that concludes this introductory video to HTML and CSS. If you'd like to look at more examples of HTML and CSS, there are a lot of free templates on the web. I have a few linked in the description below, and you should be able to see them on the video now.